Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Ask Better Questions, the podcast where we delve into leadership and personal development. I'm your host, Peter, and today I'll be discussing how the shift away from permanent employees towards a gig economy has changed the way business relate to employees, and in one of the most obvious ways, and that is how we train staff. So let's dive in. But before we do, for those of you who are new here, I'm Peter Adams. I have over 20 years experience in leadership and consulting. I'm a published author and speaker in the leadership space, and my mission is to help excellent leaders become exceptional leaders through a better mindset. Before we start today's episode, I'd like to take a minute to thank our sponsor, California Solutions. California Solutions offer leadership training for people who have reached a ceiling in their leadership journey and want to achieve more without dedicating substantial time and effort. Links are in the description for California Solutions, also one of the places that I work. So it's no secret that having last week covered Jack Welch, and Jack Welch being one of the champions of the movement towards moving jobs offshore and shifting businesses towards hiring contractors, also organizing mass layoffs, and basically breaking the bond of trust between employees and employers, one of the most notable or noticeable impacts has been that we've had a lot less money spent on training of staff. Now, it is no secret that training improves staff performance. There are countless studies that indicate this, and I should say at this point, training can impact staff performance in a positive way. It can also be a complete and comprehensive waste of time and effort. It really does depend on what you train your staff on. But knowing what to train staff on and how is a conversation that we will leave for later in this discussion. For now, let's begin by stating that the evidence I could find in studies suggested that in 1979, employees in North America typically received about 2.5 weeks of training each year. And the most recent data I could find indicated that in 1995, albeit not very recently, but recent data nonetheless, in 1995, the average employee now received about 11 hours each year. Now, this is also predominantly safety and compliance training, which is mandatory and unlikely to directly improve performance, but rather these sorts of trainings are designed to prevent catastrophic situations from occurring. It's also noteworthy that in the study, 1/5 of employees reported that they received no training at all. So that's 1/5 of employees reported in the study as receiving zero training. So that 11 hours would therefore grow based on 1/5 being at 0 hours. So averaged 11 hours, which means that some people are still getting the 2.5 weeks, but the majority of people in the workforce are getting about 11 hours, and that's the average. 11 or so hours more, give or take, maybe 13, maybe 14 hours a year, which is still very much short of the 2.5 weeks that was being received in 1979. So I guess the question should probably be asked, why is this so? And once we have the reasons, is this good or bad, and in what ways has that impacted? Well, it's not straightforward, but one of the reasons is the shift from full-time employment towards contract or temp roles. As the adage goes, training employees and watching them leave is expensive, but training employees or not training employees and having them stay is even more costly. So when I started my career as an accountant, the professional organization I was a member of had a minimum yearly training requirement to keep my license and my professional membership. Now, these requirements remain in place to this day. It is true that the kinds of roles employees did in the 70s and 80s are different to the roles most employees are doing today. There is still an enormous gap between the 2.5 weeks and 11 hours. However, the shift towards technological work, so working on a computer, and the shift away from manufacturing roles would lessen that on-the-job training some roles would have required. But retail, sales, customer service, and many other roles remain very training dependent. The nature of those roles and the way in which they're delivered may have changed. However, those roles remain very much as they would have been in the 70s and 80s. However, they may be delivered differently. So training on customer service and the retail sales, sales particularly, is still the same game it has always been, albeit it's very, very different in the approach at which it's taken. But the car sales game has evolved, and there is still a different training mindset and different methods of car sales. But car sales itself still requires a lot of training. Many large organizations are required to train on a local, a state, and a federal level, so regulations covering everything from sexual harassment to environmental laws and everything in between. And those regulations have become more numerous, not less, and that's required more and not less training. And those mandatory trainings are increasingly eating into that 11 hours a year. Keep in mind that 11 hours is an average, and 20% of those employees involved in that are getting no training at all. So even if we accept that a conscious decision has been made to move towards temporary work and deliberately reducing the training for employees, which I don't think was a deliberate move, I think it was a consequence of a management strategy. What does that mean for leaders? So if you're leading a team and they're not in a job, well, at least everyone sort of acknowledges now that you don't have jobs for life. Companies don't employ people with the intention of never laying them off and instead growing with them. And consequently, employees don't sign up for a job to stay with a company forever. There is that two-way bond has gone. It is no longer. Even people that found companies understand that they will be moving on at some point. And so they designed the company to carry on without them. So even at an executive level, executives realize, I'm here for a short time. I need to try and make my impact and move on. So what are those costs? Well, the obvious one is an increased turnover of staff. So you'll have an increase in hiring and recruitment costs. If you're not investing in your staff, then your staff will not invest in you, so you will have a higher turnover. If you have a situation where staff are being hired for skills and skills-based only, then those skills are also marketable to other employers who will also be hiring for them. So if you find that you need people that are in demand, then you will find the next point, which is skill gaps and talent shortages. If you need more programmers and there aren't a great deal of programmers out there, rather than train your own programmers, which is costly, expensive, and may not work, go out to the marketplace and hire them. And it's a sunk cost on someone else's balance sheet. Great. Well, the problem with that is that there aren't enough people doing those particular jobs with the specific skill sets that you need, and therefore it is costly to hire programmers. And when they do come on board, it can take some time to actually get traction and get roles filled and being productive. There's a decrease in employee engagement and a much reduced retention, as indicated earlier. If you are hiring people just for their skill sets and not for who they are, and you're not investing in them and they're not investing in you, then you're basically hiring people with a paycheck. And as much as I've been in many interview situations where the question has been asked, why do you want to work here? And the employee who is being interviewed shifts in their seat awkwardly, thinking, please do not say paycheck. And the employer asking the question is, please do not say paycheck, even though everyone knows that person is there for a paycheck. That is why they're coming. That's why they want the role. They want the role for the paycheck. There's very few people that are coming into companies saying, I've really wanted to work here. And those particular companies are very few, very specific and very niche. And predominantly those employers already know this, and they can pick and choose the graduates that they want or the particular people they want to have work for them. But they have earned that role and that position. It's full of anecdotes of the likes of Steve Jobs approaching the CEO of Pepsi to come over and become the CEO of Apple. Those sorts of people who are charismatic and can bring over great talent to an organization do exist, but they are rare. Predominantly, most people are at their role for the paycheck, which is unfortunate because as leaders, we want to bring the best out of our people and we want them to grow and create the environment where they can achieve their best. And people will stay in roles where they have that environment. There's also diminished adaptability and innovation. You find that where people are not being invested into, there's very little that they learn what to do on the job, and there's very little innovation in a role unless they come from an environment where they were forced to be innovative. Employees hired with specific skills in mind struggle to adapt to changing circumstances. That is fairly straightforward. Now, there are also compliance and legal risks, particularly in situations where you've got one of those employees that has zero training. Zero training done year on year will mean that anything that might be mandatory or have been missed at previous employers, these people are a liability waiting to happen. If you haven't done the basics on safety training and you haven't done the basics on legal and compliance, then those employees worry me some. Because nobody should be setting foot in a workplace without the very bare basics of mandatory compliance training. Now, that said, there are plenty of people that can do their job without these mandatory compliance trainings because they're sensible people and they won't do anything illegal. However, common sense is so rare it could be considered a superpower nowadays. Now, the last thing I wanted to cover was the potential impact on productivity and quality. If you have newly hired employees, they will take longer to reach full productivity levels without proper training and onboarding. This has been estimated to be 18 months to 3 years. Now, 18 months to 3 years, even at the most optimistic being 18 months to become fully on board and reaching peak productivity in a particular role, that is around the mark that most people are moving to another role or leaving the company. And the average for employees now is 18 months to 3 years in many different types of roles. So you start looking at that as being the time that they reach their peak productivity, they realize a company is not investing in them, not trying to move them through the organization, so therefore they leave. And this is how careers are now being plotted out, where I go to a particular company, I learn how to do X, Y, and Z, I shine in that role, I realize that company has no interest in moving me up or sideways or training me or giving me any future opportunities. And at that point, I leave to go work at another company to get a promotion. So at that point, I start looking for a promotion and I start looking outside the company. And this is an incredibly costly exercise, and I don't need to be a HR rep to be able to tell you that. But at the same time, this is why a lot of HR reps are hiring externally, because if you promote internally, you create gaps underneath. So if you hire a senior manager and you promote them up a rung, then suddenly you have to fill their seat. And if you promote internally, then you have to fill that person's seat. And if you promote internally for that role, then you have to fill another seat. And it creates a lot of disruption inside the organization. If you hire externally, it creates a lot less disruption inside an organization. However, that disruption is happening anyway because a lot of people are leaving because they're not getting internally promoted. So realistically, it's a false economy. But HR people will tell you different. So that said, what are the strategies that leaders should utilize to manage an environment, well, in an environment where training for staff has been diminished or is near non-existent? So prioritize on-the-job training, particularly cross-training and knowledge sharing. Knowledge sharing isn't the same as training, and it won't have the same impacts, but it can ease the burden. So knowledge sharing, If you've got it in a training environment, it can be formalized. If you've got it in a knowledge sharing system, it's not as formalized, but it can work very, very well depending on the knowledge sharing processes you have in place. You should also leverage online and self-paced learning resources. So if you have access to, say, LinkedIn Learning, which I've seen in previous workplaces, encourage your employees to do these things in their own time, or even allow time at work to do these during downtimes. I also, in the past, have identified and singled out employees who take it upon themselves to, in their own time, read books, do courses, etc. And I've brought that to senior management's knowledge. I've also had people who have done these things, it's been brought to their leader's attention, and their leader has done nothing with it. And then those people are the first people to leave the organization, meaning the people that have done the trainings and read books and done courses in their own time, off their own bat. And their immediate leaders have been caught short and out one great employee who was doing great things because they refused to acknowledge the fact that this person was a self-starter. I think the last thing I wanted to point out today was you want to focus on efficient onboarding and documenting all of your processes, because in a situation where you don't have your workflows and your processes documented, and I mean optimized, then you don't have the time to get people up to speed in an environment where there's no time for training and there's no training done. You need to have the documentation for processes bulletproof. And as the adage goes, when you make something idiot-proof, they will invent a better idiot. I have seen some fantastic documented processes that people still come along, look at and go, I can't follow this. At which point you start going, well, the skills of following documented procedures is a skill that should be hired for. Now, the practical upshot of everything I'm saying today is that it is critical to strike a balance, but it is also critical that you do not eliminate formal training programs in their entirety. 11 hours on average, I weep for those people that are only getting 11 hours or slightly more than that. And I also weep for the 20% who are claiming to get no training whatsoever. That will not end well for anyone, both employee or employer. I'm going to leave it there in terms of I've given some tools to take forward, but we're going to conclude tonight's episode there. I hope you found these insights valuable and actionable. If you enjoyed today's episode, like and subscribe, but more importantly, share it with somebody you feel needs to hear this. I'll be back next week with more. Until then, keep asking better questions, and remember, leadership is not about having all the answers, it's about asking the right questions. Take care, and we'll see you back here next week.